Welcome to my presentation on material, labour and fixed overhead variances, which is usually found in the AAT Level 4 Decision and Control module. So before we get started then, just a short introduction to myself. I am AAT qualified to Level 4 and I've been working now in finance for 3 years, but my ultimate ambition is to train to teach AAT in the future. I must state that all these materials are my own. They are written by me and I'm not endorsed in any way by AAT. I hope these materials help your understanding and prove to be beneficial, but more importantly, I hope you enjoy the journey that is AAT. So let's start by just taking a quick recap then on what variances are. So you will have come across variances at some point in your studies by now, I'm sure. So we'll just do a very quick run through just so that we know the types of terminology and things that we're going to be thinking about as we do our presentation this time. So a variance then, what is it? Well, it is going to be the difference between an actual and expected outcome. Okay, so the actual outcome is what the actual financial statements are going to show, and your expected outcome is usually the budget. Okay, so usually it's your actual versus budget. Our variances can be used to measure performance, so they can tell us whether we're performing higher or lower than our budget. And that information can then be used to identify perhaps the reasons why we are higher or lower, and then we can put in actions to improve our performance or benefit even more from the performance that we're already giving. Our variances can be adverse or favourable. So what this means is that your favourable variances are the ones that we like. Okay, so your favourable variances are the ones where we've either got more income than we expected or less costs than we expected. Okay, so our budget thinks that we're going to get X amount of income, but actually we got Y amount of income. So we were expecting £100, but we got £150. Okay, our budget was expecting £100 in cost, but we only spent £80. So they're your favourable variances. They're the variances that are in our favour. Your adverse variances then are the opposite. So these are where we haven't done quite so well. So this is less income than we expected or higher costs. Okay, so the budget would be saying one thing and we'd either have less income than we budgeted or higher costs than we budgeted. So it's really important when you're looking at your variances to make sure, are you looking at an income or are you looking at a cost? Because just because something's higher than budget doesn't necessarily mean that it's adverse. It could be favourable if it's an income line. So just take a quick second just to remind yourself, what is it you're looking at? And then variances can be presented in a number of different ways. So they can be presented in a monetary way, it can be presented in a percentage, and some people also, depending on what type of report they're doing, you can present them in a graph. So you can have your actual figures versus what your budget was, so you can see where you higher or lower than budget. So you can do it in a graphical format as well. So depending on what you're presenting will depend on how you present it and also the users of that information, because remember we need to make our financial information user friendly to those that are actually going to be viewing it, who may or may not have financial understanding and their background. So moving on to a type of variance then, so we've got material variances. So your material variances, you're going to have your overall direct material variance. Okay, and this is a key word here which we'll come back to in a second. The overall variance is made up of a material price variance and it's made up of a material usage variance. And this is really important, so let's have a look at what these actually mean. So a material price variance then. So this is all about what you pay for the material. Okay, so this is all going to be about your pounds per kilo or per litre, depending on what measurement it is that you're using. And then this is going to be your kilo per unit for your usage. Okay, so your material price variance is all about what you pay for the material, and your material usage variance is how much are you using in production. And these variances are going to be against your standard costs, which we'll come to when we go through an example shortly. So your material price variance is going to be what you expected to pay and then what you actually paid. And here I want to make a very clear point here that this isn't about the overall amount that you paid, because as you'll see in an example when we come on to it in a minute, it will then depend on the units produced, but this is about how much per kilo or per litre. So this is going to be a per kilo price. Then your usage variance is going to be how much, so if you're going to make a certain amount of units, how much material are you expecting to use per unit? So it's going to be what you expected to use and what you did, whoops, helpful if I spell, did use. Okay, and this will be in kilos or litres, depending on what's written in your question. So this is where your kilos per unit come in. Okay, so if you've got 1,000 units, you're going to have an expectation from your standard costs, which we'll come on to, of how many kilos per unit you're going to use. And then actually after your production's finished, how much did you use per kilo? Just because you've budgeted for something, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is what's going to be used, and that's where we start doing our calculations. So then it's then brought back to that our material price variance plus our usage variance will equal our overall material variance. So now taking a look at labour variances, we're going to have an overall direct labour variance, and the overall direct labour variance will be split down into your labour rate variance and a labour efficiency variance. Now the labour rate variance is all based on how much your employees are paid. So this is going to be about how much per hour you are paying your employees. So you're going to have what you're expecting to pay them, and then versus what you actually did pay them. And that can change for a number of reasons. It can change due to needing more skilled staff, it could change to overtime, all sorts of things. Then your labour efficiency variance, that's going to all be about how long it takes you to produce your product. Okay, so your budget is going to say that it's going to take a certain number of hours to produce so many units, so therefore you're going to have a per unit measurement in hours. Okay, so you're going to expect that production is going to take 10 hours for 1 unit, but it might only take 9 hours, for example. Okay, so this is hours per unit. So you're going to have your standard cost card, which will tell you how many hours per unit the production's meant to take, and then how many hours it actually did take. So then your rate variance plus your efficiency variance will give you your overall labour variance. Now, one thing just to talk about quickly here is just to be aware of what format the question is giving you the time in. So, for example, they may say it takes 1 hour to do as a standard cost, or it takes an hour per unit. You calculate it to be an hour per unit. But have a look, and just have a look, is it measured in minutes? Because you may have to convert minutes into hours, and make sure that you're giving your answer in the correct format that they're asking for. So it's always just worth checking what unit, what measurement is in the question. Because for these sorts of things, with the calculations, you can do it, you know, it's fairly straightforward, so you can then do it, and it would be a shame to then miss out on a mark because you've not converted it into hours or converted it into minutes. So try not to make that mistake going forwards. So we're going to look now at calculating standard costs. So this is going to be a really important part of when you're given a question and you need to work out your variances. Before you even start looking at variances, I strongly recommend you work out all of the standard costs that you're going to need. So when you're doing this, it's all about identifying what you are expecting to pay per unit. So at this particular point, we don't need to worry about how many units have been produced in your actual production. We don't need to worry about how much material you've actually used or how long it's actually taken you. All we're concerned about is what were we expecting to do. So here we've got that we're going to use this product Sky 06 for the next few slides when we're working out our variances as well. So when we're given something like this, I really recommend you look at what the standard costs are first. Make a note of them, and then you've got them always to refer back to when you're actually calculating your variances. So we're going to have to work out 4 different types of cost, standard cost. So we're going to work out how much material we're using per unit, how much material that costs per kilogram, how many hours we're spending per unit, and what our cost is per hour. So in terms of how this is going to fit into our variances, so this one here is going to be our material usage variance. This one here will be our material price variance. This one here will be our labour efficiency variance. And this is going to be our labour rate variance. Okay, so let's just go through then step by step, and we'll work out our standard costs for Sky 06. So the only thing that we're going to be interested in working out standard costs is going to be our budget figures. Okay, so for this particular purpose, we're going to completely forget about what actually happened for now. We're just interested in what are we expecting per unit. Right, so our material per unit. So our material per unit, we're told here that we've got a production of 50,000 units, and we're going to have let's highlight these as we go. We're using 10,000 kilograms of material, and that 10,000 kilograms cost us £21,500. And that makes our 50,000 units. So our material per unit then, we're going to want to divide the total amount of material by the total number of units produced. So we're going to want our 10,000 kilograms divided by our 50,000 units, and that gives us 0.2 kilograms per unit. So our expectation is for 1 unit of Sky 06 we are going to need 0.2 kilograms of material. So we then need to know how much we're expecting to pay for that material. So we look at our budget again, and we've got 10,000 kilos at £21,500. So we're going to want to see how much does that cost per kilogram. So per kilogram, it's going to be £21,500 divided by our 10,000 kilograms, and that gives us £2.15 per kilo. So there's our standard cost then for our materials. So moving on then to our labour, we can see that to make our 50,000 units, we're expecting it to take 15,000 hours, and we're expecting those 15,000 hours to cost us £112,500. So using this, we can then work out what our expected costs are per unit for labour. So our hours per unit then, we're going to say that we worked 15,000 hours, and we're going to divide that by the total number of units that we made in that time, which was 50,000, and that gives us a 0.3 hours per unit standard. And then to do the same, very similar to what we've done with the material cost per kilogram, we're going to work out what our labour rate was, or what we expect it to be. So we paid 112,500, and we're going to divide that by our 15,000 hours, which gives us a total of £7.50 per hour. For now, I'm going to leave the fixed overheads alone, because we'll come on to that when we do our variance calculations. But here you can see now that we've got our material per unit here at 0.2. We've got our cost per kilogram at £2.15. We've got our hours per unit, 0.3 hours, and our cost per hour at £7.50 an hour. And it's those figures that you're going to want to now use when you go to start looking at your actuals, which we'll come on to over the next couple of slides. Okay, So we're going to look at material variances now and the calculations you need. So here's our question from the previous slide, so it's exactly the same. And on the left hand side here I'm going to bring up the standard costs that we worked out. And it's really useful to do this and just keep them to the side on a bit of paper while you're working through these questions in your exam. So to start with them, we're going to need to work out what our overall material variance is. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to take what we budgeted to spend for our budgeted units and work out how much it is per unit. So we're going to say 21,500 divided by 50,000 units equals 43p per unit. So we know that we are expecting for every unit to spend 43p in total on our materials. So then to apply that to our actual figure, we made 52,500 units. We're expecting that to cost us 43p per unit. So therefore we're expecting a material spend of £22,575. However, when we look at our actual production, we can see that we actually spent £49,613. So we're going to say what should we have spent? And we're going to take away what we did spend, and then that gives us a variance of £27,038. And because we spent more than we should have done, so this turns out to be a negative, it's actually an adverse variance. So we spent more than we should have done. And this figure here, this is going to be important coming up later, because that's going to be the figure that we're going to balance back to make sure that we've got our different types of variances balancing back to the overall variance. So let's move on then to our material usage variance. So our first stop then is we need to work out what we should have used in our actual production. So our actual production was 52,500 units, and we're going to multiply that by the material we should have used from our standard cost, and that gives us that we should have used 10,500 kilos. So to make our actual production, we would have expected to have used 10,500 kilos. However, we actually used 15,750 kilos. So our variance in kilos then is 10,500 kilos of what we should have used. Multiply that out, minus off our 15,750 that we did use. And then we have our material variance in kilos of 5,250 kilos. And again, this is adverse because this would be a negative because this is what we should have used. And we actually used 5,250 kilograms more. So this is adverse. But we need to have that in a pounds figure. Saying 5,250 kilos doesn't tell us how much that cost. So our actual variance then is going to be 5,250 kilos. And we're going to multiply that by what we would have expected to have paid per kilo. So that gives us a variance of £11,287.50 adverse. So that's the first part of our material variance. So the second part then is made up of a material price variance. So what we need to do is we need to work out how much we should have paid for our material, for our actual production. So we used 15,750 kilos in our actual production. We were expecting to pay £2.15 per kilo from our standard costs. So therefore we are going to be expecting to pay £33,862.50. That's what we should have paid for the actual material that we used. But what we did pay for the material used was £49,613. So our actual variance then is what we should have paid, £33,862.50, minus what we did pay, £49,613, and that gives us £15,750.50 adverse variance, because we've paid more than we should have done. We paid 49,613, but we should have only paid for that number of kilograms of material. We should have only paid 33,862.50. So now the important part here is to now check what our material usage variance and our material price variance adds up to. So we've got our usage variance of £11,287.50. We've got our price variance of £15,750. And when you add those together, that equals £27,038, which brings us right back to our overall material variance. So it's really important then here that you can see how this is made up. So just to recap, first of all, we worked out what our actual overall material variance was going to be up here. So we knew we were expecting an overall variance of £27,038. Then we broke it down and we said, okay, so how much material should we have used for the actual production? And then how much did we use for the actual production? And then that gave us our kilogram difference. And then we times that by our standard cost to give us it in a value. Then we had a look at what our actual production for the price variance was. So we used 15,750 kilo. We should have paid £2.15, and therefore we should have spent that much, but we actually paid 49,613, which then gave us our 15,750 and 50p adverse variance. Then when you put those two figures together, it brings you back to your 27,038, therefore proving that your price overall was right up here. So now let's take a look at our labour variances then and the calculations you need. So again, here's the question and our standard costs. Let's bring those up again. So we're going to start off again by working out our overall variance just over at the side here, and then we know that we're going to be balancing back to this figure once we've worked out our labour rate and efficiency variances. So we need to work out how much we were expecting to pay per unit, so we're going to be using our budgeted figures here. So it's going to be 112,500 divided by our 50,000 units, and that gives us £2.25p per unit. So then we're going to use our actual units that we produced, multiply it by our £2.25, and that gives us £118,125. So we expected to spend 118,125, but in fact we only spent 70,875, which gives us a £47,250 favourable variance, because we were expecting £118,125, but we actually only paid 70,875. So our overall variance is £47,250 favourable. So splitting these down then, let's have a look at our labour efficiency variance. So our labour efficiency variance then is all about the number of hours that we were expecting to spend on the units. So we know that our actual production was 52,500 units. We also worked out previously that our standard cost, so our standard amount that we're expecting, is 0.3 hours per unit. So we'll multiply that out and we get 15,750 hours. So for the actual production of 52,500 units, we would have expected to have spent 15,750 hours. But actually, when we look at our actual production figures, we only spent 10,500 hours. So our variance in hours is what we should have spent, 15,750, minus what we did spend making them, and that's a variance of 5,250 hours. Now, just like we saw on the material variances, having them in hours or kilos doesn't help, so we need to put that into a price, into a value. So we're going to then multiply it by the labour rate, that we were expecting. So our variance in pounds is our variance in hours, 5,250 hours, multiply it by our £7.50 per hour expected rate, our standard cost, and that gives us a variance of 39,375 favourable. We should have spent 15,750 hours making the actual units, but we only spent 10,500 hours. So therefore our variance is favourable of £39,375. So the other type of variance related to labour then is our labour rate variance. So how much are we paying per hour for our workers? So for actual production then, so we know we spent 10,500 hours. Our standard cost that we worked out is £750 per hour. So for the actual hours, we would have expected to have spent £78,750. But we can see here that we actually spent £70,875. So our variance therefore is what we were expecting to spend for the amount of hours minus what we did spend, and that gives us a variance of £7,875 favourable. Again, we were expecting 78,750. We only spent 70,875, so therefore our variance is favourable. So let's do what we done on the last slide then and add these together. So we had our efficiency variance of £39,375. We had our rate variance of £7,875, and when you add those together you get an overall variance of £47,250 favourable, and that brings us back to our overall variance as well. So the final variance then we need to work out is our overhead variances. So our question here, and we're looking here for the fixed overhead expenditure variance. So this one's nice and easy as we're only looking for expenditure. So our standard cost then £60,000 is what we were expecting to spend, and our actual cost was 61,500. So when we work out the difference between them, we get a £1,500 adverse variance because they were higher than what we were expecting. And that's all the expenditure variances. Previously you had to work out different types of overhead variances, but now we only have to focus on the overhead expenditure variance, and that is literally what you were expecting to pay and what you actually did pay. Okay, so once we have worked out all of our actual individual variances, we can start to bring it together and work out that how all of the different variances make up the variance that the overall variance for the actual production. So first of all, I'm going to bring up this box here and our standard costs, and we're just going to very quickly go through and work out, based on our standards costs, exactly how much our actual production should have cost us. So all of the details obviously are on the previous slides, so I'm just going to take you through them now, but hopefully you can go back and have a look should you get stuck. So our actual production for our units, we made 52,500, and that's going to be a key figure now. So first of all, for our material, so for our actual production, 52,500 units, we're going to multiply that by the amount of material we should have used, and also by the price per kilo. So you can break this down into two individual steps if you want to, but just to pull this together so I can then show you how the other variances fall into this, I'm just going to do it all in one calculation, which means our material should have cost us 22,575. Our labour should have been our actual number of units multiplied by our standard number of hours per unit multiplied by our standard labour rate, 750 per hour, and that gives us the total of 118,125. And then our overhead was budgeted to be 60,000. So when you add those figures up, our actual production should have cost us £200,700. If you look back at the previous slides in the question, you'll see that our actual production cost us a little bit less than that. So we're going to do our actual production less our, just write that again, less the actual cost of production, and that gives us an 18,712 favourable variance overall. So that's taking everything into account. So now let's populate what we know. So our direct overall material variance was £27,038 adverse, and that was broken down into a material price variance of £15,750 50p adverse, and a usage variance of £11,287 50p adverse. Our overall labour variance was £47,250 favourable. Our labour rate variance was £7,875 favourable, and our efficiency variance was £39,375 favourable. Our fixed overhead variance was £1,500 adverse. So if we now add all these variances together, so remember, if it's an adverse variance, you're going to have to put it in as a negative, and your favourable variances are all going to be positive numbers. Okay, so if you then pop all of those into your calculator, you will come out with an 18,712 favourable variance, and that matches back to this. So your production budgeted cost for your actual production is 2,700. Our actual production was 181,988, and that's our variance there. So hopefully you can see then how if you can work out what your overall variance is for your actual production based on your standard costs, you can then break it down into your material variances, your labour variances, your overhead variances, and then add that all together and you'll come back to your overall variance. So my final thoughts then for this presentation. Before starting these questions, just stop for a couple of seconds. Don't rush into it and remind yourself of the should and did concept. So what should your production cost you and what did it cost you? And that's a really important mindset to get your head around, and just try and think about it in those terms. Talk to yourself, but talk to yourself in your head in your exam, obviously. But talk to yourself. Ask yourself those questions step by step. So, how much material am I expecting to use? How much does that cost per kilo, per litre, whatever you're given in your question? Okay. Talk to yourself. Does it make sense what you're saying? Look at your variances. Is that higher or lower than what you were expecting, and therefore is it adverse or favourable? So have that little short conversation with yourself. But remember, do try to do it in your head. Make sure you work out your standard costs before you do anything else. So if you're given a question in the exam to work these out, forget about your actuals to start with and make a very quick note of how much material per unit you're going to be using, how much per kilo, per litre, whatever the measurement is that you're given, does it cost at standard in your budget? What's your labour rate per hour? And how many hours does it take to produce a unit? Work all of those individual things out and have it written on a bit of paper next to you, because then it means that you've already got those when you need to apply it. And then look at your production quantity of your actual, and then apply your standard costs to see where you should have come out in terms of your variances. So it's this should and did concept again. Okay, so your actual production quantity was 1,000 units. Apply what you should have been paying for your material, apply what you should have been paying for your labour, work out where you should have come out, and then you can go on and calculate the individual variances. And of course, be sure to check everything back to your overall variance. Okay, so that's your overall production variance that we just done on the last slide there, but also the individual overall material variances made up of your usage and your price, your overall labour variance made up of your efficiency and rate variances. You then add into your overhead variance, expenditure variance, and that will come back to your overall production variance as well. And at the end of the day, as I always say, is practice makes perfect, almost. And I really wish you the very best of luck for your exams, and I hope this presentation has helped.